And there's an Errol. Good afternoon. How are you? And we are about to start. Well, everyone, I would like to thank you for coming in today. As we begin to transition in, I want everyone to know, welcome to Ask the Professional series being put on by the BBPA to support the community, particularly as we go through this crisis as we're going through right now. I'm Anton James, and I will be the host today as we discuss employment legislation, particularly as it relates to the COVID-19 situation that we're currently in. Today, as our esteemed guest, we have Miss Michelle Henry. She's a distinguished lawyer and a multi-award-winning lawyer and a partner at Borden, Ladner, and Gervais, Canada's law firm, one of the largest law firms or full-service law firms in the city with over 725 lawyers. And she's actually a partner. Yeah, woohoo! Additionally, among other things, she's also been one of the co-chairs of the Black Business Law Clinic and among a lot of top community work. Awards, some awards and recognitions include, this year, she is recently a recipient of a 2020 edition of the Best Lawyer in Canada for Labor and Employment, and was a nominee in the past for Canada's top lawyers and the most influential going forward. So Michelle specializes her experience representing companies in human rights litigation and representing clients before the Human Rights Tribunal and Commission at the federal and the provincial tribunals. So today we get the opportunity to talk to one of our very own, Miss Michelle Henry. How you doing, Tanya? I see you here as well.
Thanks, Anton.
So Miss Michelle, tell us about yourself. Tell us, give us some of your background, where were you born, where you went to school, and how you got involved.
So I'm Lucian. I was born in St. Lucia. I moved to Canada. It was September, talking about heat. It was September when I moved to Canada. I was turning 16 that month. And I felt it was the coldest I've ever been. And September is not cold, right? But when you're coming from St. Lucia, it's pretty cold. So I will never forget moving here and thinking I will not be able to survive this weather. So I moved to Ottawa. I did 2 years of high school there, and then moved to Toronto for my undergrad and my master's, and then law school. So I've been in Toronto ever since, and I've been at CLG as well.
Okay. And so growing up, what were some of your main influences? What was your influences? What was important to you? And what really shaped whether your education or your personal life?
Well, hopefully none of my siblings join in, but one of my, I have 10 siblings, and one of my key goals was trying to get away as far as possible. And when you have a big family, and my family has always been very big on education. So I always thought, if there is a way out, it's always through education, trying to provide opportunities for yourself. So my key motivation was always that. And I was always driven by, how can I give back to the community, and what sort of, legal education or education will give me the opportunities to do that and have options. So law seems like one of those options. And I will admit that when I started law school, I did go in thinking I was going to be an international human rights lawyer, doing all this good. And there I am on Bay Street, 16 years later. So it is different, but I do feel like I have played a role in terms of, shaping my practice and certainly helping out the community as well.
Okay. And okay, as you were going through, what brought you, or why focus on employment law? Why focus in that in contrast to the international?
Well, I guess it was after my first year of law school, I was doing a summer fellowship at the African Canadian Legal Clinic. I don't know if some of you guys are familiar with it. And at that time, they were making some changes to the Employment Standards Act, and I was helping the African Canadian Legal Clinic with the deposition on the impact of those changes to visible minorities and people who are low-income employees. And from that interest, I really got to know, employment law, and it seemed to be a good area where, no matter what you do, it's always busy. There's always something going on. There's always someone needing help in that area. And it's so vast in terms of the industries that you can go into and you can advise clients on. So it seems to be, the best fit for me in terms of practice areas.
Right. Well, When you mentioned that, so talk to me about what do you see? You've had a lot of experience now. What do you see as some of the major challenges or employers in our community?
I think some of the, well, I would probably say the major challenge is more in terms of businesses and how we run a business, and then that tends to impact how you deal with your employees, right? And I think in our community, there's a couple of things. One of them is, the reality is that we don't have a lot of role models, right? We may have lots of siblings in terms of generational. We don't have our, mothers and fathers who've owned businesses. Very rarely do we have parents who've sort of gone through that, right? And then we have our sort of, I would say in terms of how we get into business sometimes, and this is a bit of a generalization, but we tend to be a very laid back culture, at least, West Indians tend to be anyway, and, some of the African countries are as well. And I think sometimes that gets in the way of spending the time to really document how we deal with employees, how we deal with business generally, right? So I think most of us can say that we've, gotten into business or have some sort of partnership with a family member that we haven't documented or a friend that we haven't documented. And it's just a handshake as opposed to spending the time to think about how is this going to work? How am I going to pay this employee? How am I going to terminate the relationship? What happens if there are any difficulties in those relationships? So just spending the time up front and making sure you do your homework in terms of the employee, the background, and that takes a lot of effort. And I think in our community, we tend not to do as much as we need to get it right to begin with.
Hmm. So, what do we need to get it right? Would you say, is it more like education? Is it just adoption? Like, what is it needed to get it right?
Well, I think education is a big thing, and it's not just our community. I mean, I have lots of big clients, U.S. clients, for instance, who have no idea what Canadian employment law means, right? So it's spending the time on first of all understanding what your obligations are as an employer, right? What you can cannot do, because it's going to get you in trouble if you don't get it right, and you may get stuck with an employee having to pay a very big severance to that employee. So educating yourself on what the legal requirements are, and there are lots of resources available. If you go on the Ministry of Labor website, for instance, there are lots of resources on, what the employer's rights are and what the employee's rights are in terms of, wages, hours of work, layoffs, terminations, and all of that. So spending the time on educating yourself on that piece, but also, spending some time and trying to be creative. Sometimes there are, different arrangements that you can make where you may not be able to have an employee work full time for you. You may not be able to have someone as an employee, but can you hire them as a contractor? Are they truly a contractor? So think about different arrangements that will work for you and the employee that may fit into your business model a lot better than having a strict, traditional employee style relationship is an option as well.
Okay. You'd mentioned earlier on that one of the challenges within our community setting up businesses is really thinking it through properly up front. At what stage should someone do that? Like if someone's setting up a business, is it when they get to a certain size? Should it be in the initial planning phase? Should it be when they get to a certain revenue point? When should someone actually look to do that?
I would say try to do as much preparation as before as you can, right? So, when I look at any litigation file I'm on or any sort of career goals, I always think, what are the goals? What are my objectives long term, right? So it's very important for when you're starting your business and when you're thinking of growing your business to have a business plan. Where do I see myself 2 years from now? Where do I see myself 5 years from now and 10 years from now? What do I need to do to get there? What are some of the resources I need to tap into? What are some of the, training I need to receive to get there? And the more time you spend doing your homework up front, the more comfortable you are when something like COVID happens, for instance, right? Because then you are not sort of, no income, you haven't planned for what's going to happen in terms of a crisis. So spend as much time having a contingency plan in place, and thinking about, what happens on a rainy day? How am I going to, do I have enough income, or do I have enough of, on the books to take me through a 3-month crisis, for instance? So spending the time, and I know, it's difficult when we're starting, you want to start a business, you're passionate about it, you want to make sure.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Can you hear us? We're losing you for a second there,
um,
Michelle. You there?
that you get out there as quickly as
Michelle, you have to go
possible, right?
back
So
about
trying to spend some
10
time on
seconds.
business
We
plan,
lost for
human
about 10
resources.
seconds. We
Oh,
lost for
you
about
lost
10
me.
seconds.
Okay.
Yeah, go back about
Alrighty. I did tell my kids make sure they stay off Netflix and everything else. So so hopefully, can you
believe.
hear me okay now?
Now you're good. You're perfect.
Okay. So I think it, in terms of, when you're doing your business plan, you think about what you need from a human resources perspective, right? In terms of supporting the business. What do you need in terms of infrastructure, whether it's you have to lease somewhere, what do you need in terms of suppliers, all of these things that you really should be spending a lot of time thinking up front and thinking about what your growth plan is going to be, as you go through it over the next few years.
Okay, so that's good on the growth side, right? So, but when you're starting a business, or if you already have one, at
Mhm.
what point, because most people that aren't lawyers aren't necessarily going to know what to look for to mitigate potential challenges. So, what should they be looking for, and what are key triggers that they know? Listen, we got to get legal involved at this point.
Yeah. So first of all, if you're getting into a business with someone other than yourself, right? So if you're getting business partners, right? And whether they are just, people that, you've grown up with, or people, family members, I think the first thing to do is to paper the document. You want to decide, is this going to be a partnership? It's going to be deciding on what the structure of the business is going to be, right? Am I going to have a corporation, a sole proprietorship? And spending some time thinking about the benefits of those structures, right? I'm not a tax lawyer, but there are some benefits that you get from being a sole proprietor as opposed to a corporation, in terms of how you can apply, different assets and tax deductions and that sort of stuff. So spending some time thinking of that up front. If you are getting to business with a partner, anyone else, I highly recommend, if you don't take anything from this today, is make sure you get something documented in terms of what happens, in the event of a termination of the relationship, what happens with the assets. Does someone get a right of first refusal if somebody wants to leave the business? So thinking about those things and not trusting that we'll figure it out because we are good friends, right? And I think a lot of times in our culture, we are very trusting. We say, okay, you know what, we'll figure it out. We'll deal with it. It won't come to that, but if it comes to that, we'll figure it out later. So spending the time up front documenting what the relationship is with your partners, but also figuring out what your business structure is to begin with, right? Whether you have to incorporate and any of the tax advice you need in advance. So these are things that you'll be thinking of. And sometimes you get, halfway through your business and decide, well, I need to change my structure now. I'm a sole proprietor. I need to move to a corporation. And you need to get the proper advice to do that. So the best advice I can give is to make sure you do your homework, right? There's lots of resources available online in terms of incorporation and how to set up a business, and making sure you access those resources that are available.
Perfect. One more question. One more question on this one. If someone currently right now has a business and they have never really pursued a lawyer other than in the setup and the finalization, is there any advice you would tell someone to do at this point?
Well, I guess it depends on, there's a lot of different, there's tax advice you can get, right? There's, employee advice you can get in terms of how your relationships are set up. There's, different kinds of, in terms of, leasing and all of those things. So I think it depends. I think it's always good to have a second eye. There are lots of corporate lawyers who you can sit down with and sort of go through your business structure and talk about those issues. So I do think from time to time, it's good to get one of those checks done and say, am I doing this correctly? Is there anything that I'm missing out? Are there any, for instance, with your tax lawyer, are there any deductions that I can have or that I'm not actually accessing right now? So I always say, you know what, it doesn't have to cost you $10,000. You can have one of those, half an hour consultations where you say, this is where I'm at. This is where I may be needing some advice on.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Let's now switch gears a little bit now and talk to us about what you've been seeing, particularly as it relates to COVID-19 issues. Talk about some of the issues.
So I do management side law, employment law. So I'm always on for the company in 99.9% of the cases. And some of the things that we're seeing is, for instance, a lot of the businesses have been closed, right? And I don't know for you guys whether you've had to lay off employees or do something like that. So some of the things we're seeing are What are the ways we can mitigate cost over the next few months, right? Is it through layoffs, through reducing employee compensation, through reducing employees' work week? And the issues around that is that, you know, if you're laying off somebody without pay, is this constructive dismissal? Am I essentially dismissing the employee such that they can now say they're entitled to a severance pay? So thinking about what your options are and how you can mitigate those risks, right? So for instance, with a layoff in Ontario, under the Employment Standards Act, you can lay off an employee for up to 13 weeks if you're not providing any benefits. If you are extending benefits, you can then move the layoff to up to 35 weeks. I did hear that there may be some amendments to the Employment Standards Act coming down next month, which may extend the 13 weeks a bit longer, but these are options you need to think of. Now, the Employment Standards Act may permit you to lay off an employee, but it doesn't mean that you actually can, right? And that's where the constructive dismissal risk comes in. And you need to consider those risks when you are thinking about. So these are some of the issues we're seeing. The other big one is the wage subsidy. So we've all heard about, you know, the wage subsidy that's come out and the applications for that, and when do you qualify as an employer, you know, when your revenues are, you know, the first month was 15%, the other months are 30%. So, you know, sort of walking employers through that and whether they qualify and how they can bring back the employees. They may not be able to open the office, but they can at least rehire the employees and have them take the 75% wage subsidy as opposed to getting nothing. So these are options that we've been talking about. The other issue is that, you know, sometimes you may be in an essential business, right? So if you're working at a hospital, you're working at a grocery store, for instance, these are essential businesses, and the employees have been working.
Oh, we lost you again. We lost you. Netflix kicking in. Netflix kicking in.
We have
No, we need a slipper. We need a float. We need to throw a slipper out there because Netflix is
requesting leaves as a result of COVID-19. You lost me again. Okay.
We lost you. We lost you.
Just keep I told my kids to stay off, so hopefully you lost me. Okay. All right. It looks like my connection is good though.
You know what? It's just sporadic. So many people.
Can you hear me okay now?
You're back great. It's
okay.
It's just
I'm trying to keep everything closed here, so. Okay, am I okay now?
Yep,
okay.
You're great.
So in terms of leaves requests, so for instance, in Ontario, and most of the provinces have that, where there's emergency leaves that employees can request. These are protected leaves. They are unpaid leaves, but they are protected leaves. So these are some of the things that we're working with clients in terms of figuring out what are your options when an employee says, I cannot come to work. Yes, your office is open, but I cannot come to work because I have a child to support at home or an aging parent or something of that sort.
Yeah. And what do you perceive in terms of foreshadow of that becoming an issue, and how do companies mitigate against that? So if they have key employees and, you know, X percentage of them say, I can't come in, what is an employer's options?
Well, you do have, if it's for one of the protected leaves, for instance, so somebody isn't able to come to work because they have young kids at home and the schools are closed. These are protected leaves. So you know, in those cases, you have to sort of give the employee the time off that they're requesting. So again, it goes back to my point of trying to be creative, right? If the person cannot work full time, they may be able to work part time for you and give you a few hours every so often, right? And say, okay, I can't work the mornings because my kids are, you know, I have to walk them through the schoolwork. Can I work later on in the afternoon? Do they have to actually be in the office at your business, at your place of business in order to work? So these are considerations, trying to be creative. You know, if the employee is applying for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, there may be some difficulty in paying them because you can only get paid up to $1,000 every 4 weeks. So these are some of the considerations. Can you have them work for up to that $1,000 every 4 weeks, and then they can still qualify for the CERB? So thinking about how you can mitigate those in terms of, you know, whether you can have employees do other duties. So some clients, you know, have redeployed employees into other roles, right? So they may not have work in one area of the business because that area has slowed down, and trying to get the employees buy-in to do work in other areas. And again, it goes to, you know, is this constructive dismissal? Can employees say they've been dismissed because they are being asked to do work that they weren't hired to do, right? And this is where it comes to getting the employees buy-in, getting them on side, explaining to them that we are trying to take those measures in terms of keeping everyone employed, right? So some clients are saying, well, you have the option of being laid off because your area is not doing well, or you can work into this other area which provides you the opportunity to earn an income and continue to work. So trying to think of, where can I fit the employees? Where can I get, those human resources available that may not otherwise be available?
Okay, that's actually interesting. So as a company side, again, what is the best way, or what would you advise? So in the event they have to shuffle employees from one position to the next,
Yeah.
and their position, role, income actually changes, is that a permanent shift? And if so, how do they mitigate? Because that could definitely lead to potential legal challenges.
It would, and to the extent that you can try to keep those changes as short as possible. I think with COVID, it's obviously unpredictable, right? So where we've done, sort of a redeployment of employees, or we've done a salary reduction, right? Or you move from a 5-day work week to a 3-hour. It's important to be transparent with these employees and try to explain to them that these are short-term measures that we are taking, right? So if it's temporary for 3 months and say, we anticipate that it will end, at the end of August, right? So try to take those measures, and you may get pushback from employees. And we've had clients where employees have said, no, I'm not taking a 20% reduction in salary, or I'm not doing this. And you have to decide how you're going to deal with those on a case by case. But the more transparent you are with employees in terms of why you are taking those measures and how long you anticipate those measures will last, is certainly going to help you in the long run, right? So if you're saying, I'm going to redeploy you to this other position, and as a result, I have to change your compensation, you can say, but come September 1st, I'm going to put you back to your previous compensation. So that sort of, gives them some wiggle room. And in those cases, it's unlikely, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's unlikely that an employee is going to quit and claim constructive dismissal if this is only a measure that's going to last for 3 months, for instance, right? Because it's just the cost of litigation is just not worth it for them. So trying to get the employee buy-in, explain to them why you need to take those measures, will certainly help them to consent to some of those changes that you have to implement.
So what about, first of all, great information, but what about in the instance where someone's given a different opportunity, but without a defined timeline?
So in terms of just saying this is the normal course, and permanently this is the arrangement we'll have.
Well, they don't say permanently, but they don't say at the end of 3 months. Say they shifted. How does one, both from an employer protect themselves, or if that's what they foresee having to happen in order to stay in business?
Yeah.
Is there a better way to handle it, or?
Well, unfortunately there isn't, right? Because I think, we've had to do some terminations as a result of COVID, right? And some businesses anticipate that they will not go back to where they used to be, right? So there's obviously more risk to the business, right? If you think those measures are going to be more longer term than a couple of months. So the risk is there a possible constructive dismissal claim? More likely than in a short-term situation. So these are some of the things you want to mitigate in terms of, do you give the employee the options of saying, okay, I cannot afford to keep you at the salary and the role that you're in, so I'll give you the option of a severance of employment, right, where you get a severance package, or you can consent to moving into this lower role at a lower pay, and these are your options, right? So thinking about, at the end of the day, if you're reducing somebody's salary by more than 10%, for instance, permanently, there's a very good chance that would be deemed a constructive dismissal, for instance, right? So in those cases, you want to think, do I mitigate my risk up front, or do I wait till the person makes a big stink about it and then deal with it at the end of the road?
Initial insight. What is your thoughts there?
You want to hear in terms of what I think it will? Well, I always say, it's so unpredictable in terms of what's going to happen. I think most employees are agreeing. I've done lots of employee salary reductions over the last couple of months, some involving hundreds of employees at the same time. And we've just told the employees, this is what's going to happen. And the client, has said, okay, we'll take the risk. And in very few of those cases have employees come back and said, I've been constructively dismissed. I think the uncertainty of the situation we're in, employees are less likely to complain and raise their hand and say, I'm quitting and saying I've been dismissed, because they don't know whether they're going to get the next job, right? So I think we're in a situation where it is possible that employees will accept those. The other thing that we have been seeing, although we have no cases on it yet, is in most provisions, there are under employment standards legislation, there's references to unforeseen circumstances. So for instance, in Quebec, we have what's called force majeure, right? And we sort of been looking at whether the COVID situation presents these unforeseen circumstances such that it's a frustration of the employment contract and no severance pay is payable. So it's something that, we'll see what happens over the next few years, but certainly some companies are saying, I can't afford to give you any notice of termination and your employment is going to end because this is a force majeure. My business has been forced to close because of this, and therefore there's no entitlement. So it's a bit draconian, but it's certainly something that some of the employers and businesses are looking at as well.
Okay. Everyone, I'd like to thank, again, we're continue going on. We're here with Michelle Henry. If you have any questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll read the questions off to Michelle as we continue to go on. Before we transition into talking about some of the emerging challenges that you have, what advice right now, based upon your experience, particularly with smaller companies? With larger companies, I think there is a lot more structure, infrastructure set in order to handle this, but what would you advise smaller companies, or what have you seen with smaller companies dealing with employees that they've had to let go, or going through this process?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether the business has been forced to close, right? So if you're dealing with a small retailer, for instance, who have a couple of part-time employees who really can't afford to continue to have these employees on the payroll, what we are seeing is that it's just a strict layoff where they lay the employees off. The employees can either apply for EI or the CERB. What I understand is that the government is pushing everybody under the CERB, so that's what they are going under. So that's pretty much the very basic. You can't hire the employee, you can't keep the employees on payroll, so you lay them off. For companies that are continuing to do business and are deemed essential, we are seeing, sometimes you get the employee to agree to work less. So for instance, your business has slowed down and you can only afford to pay the employees part-time, and getting the employees to agree to those arrangements. So the more traditional ones, as opposed to, trying to fit them under some sort of wage subsidy or something. But I do encourage the small businesses to think about the wage subsidy as an option, because it's certainly something that's open to them as well, right?
Okay. So going forward now, as we're moving out of COVID and quote unquote the quarantine, talk to me about what do you see as some of the employment issues for a small business going forward?
So I guess a few things. So social distancing rules. So we've heard a lot about, if you're opening, make sure you don't have staff sitting next to each other, right? So thinking about if you have an office space, for instance, how are you going to address social distancing? If it's a retail store, if it's some kind of business where you have a small space with desks next to each other, how can you mitigate so you can address those social distancing rules? Do you have employees work from home on a specific day and only have half your staff come in? So thinking about those rules beforehand in terms of, common areas, how do you deal with common areas? Are people allowed to take all of their lunches at the same time? Do you stagger start times and end times so people are not in the same space so thinking about those implementation of social distancing rules in your business. The other big thing is employee screening. So for a big company, they can have apps, they can have different kinds of measures to make sure they screen the employees in advance. For small businesses, it's going to be a little bit different. If you have 2 to 3 employees, right, you're not going to implement an app for the employees to fill out before they enter the workforce, right? So think about how you can get the employee to screen themselves before they come into the office, and there are a lot of guidelines that if you go on any of the public health websites, there are lots of guidelines in terms of the kinds of screening questions that you can ask your employees and to determine whether they are symptomatic and whether they should really stay at home, right? So looking at those measures and having the employees answer those questions before they get into the workplace. The other thing that employees are doing are temperature checks where you have a thermometer and you're testing the person. Again, if you're small businesses, there's probably less of a chance that you'll have somebody at the door doing a temperature check, right? But if you have 2 to 3 employees, there's nothing wrong with telling these employees before you come into the office, I want you to make sure you do a temperature check every day to make sure that you don't have a fever, right? So these are things to think about. The other thing that we're seeing with small businesses is that, there is some attraction to people working from home now, right? So if you can save money on a lease going forward, is it possible to continue to have these employees work from home, right? So thinking about what your current arrangement is and whether that's something that's doable long-term and whether your employment contract provides for that, right? So we have been getting the question of, can you impose a work from home arrangement on all your employees going forward, right? I mean, I know I would go crazy if somebody forced me to work from home every day because it's just, I need a change of environment. But thinking about, can you have an arrangement where somebody's maybe working part-time at the office and part-time, from home? So what can you save money in that regard? You now have the infrastructure to make employees work from home. So how can you take advantage of that? The other issue that we're seeing is employees who are suddenly coming in or maybe advising the employees that they've tested positive for COVID, right? So if your business is reopening and an employee calls and says, I've tested positive for COVID, the employee has been at work for a couple of days, what do you need to do in those situations? So of course, you want to make sure you're contacting public health right away and dealing with any close contact that the employee has, if they're in the same place as other employees, you want to make sure you're addressing those and dealing with any self-isolation issues. I would strongly encourage anyone who has an employee who tested positive to make sure you contact public health right away in terms of getting guidance from them on what to do next and contact tracing. And there are also obligations in terms of Ministry of Labor. If you have an employee who's tested positive, there are obligations to contact the Ministry of Labor as well. So making sure that you have those in line and having a point person. If it's a small business, but you want to make sure that employees know exactly who to go to in terms of any of those issues. Who do they call if they have a family member or themselves have tested positive for COVID and there's some concerns about self-isolation. The other issue is, and we've talked about this.
I want to stop for a quick second there because you're getting some good insights. But I see some questions that came up before. I just want to address them because they're some of the issues.
Okay.
One was, what do you recommend companies do to prevent misclassification of employees and constructive dismissal temporarily, as employees work a modified schedule? Yes. Work a modified schedule. And will this be available to view later? I have to make a client call. Oh yeah, okay. What would you recommend there? That was the question. What do you recommend companies do to prevent misclassification of employees and constructive dismissal temporarily as employees work a modified schedule?
Okay, so I guess there are 2 issues there. There's the issue of classification of employees, right? Which we get all the time. So you don't want to have employees on your books. You call them consultants, you call them independent contractors, right? And in those cases, you can say, well, the employees may not be entitled to any kind of compensation because they're not true employees, they're independent contractors, right? That's not really a COVID issue, it's more of a general issue of how do you classify an employee? If you're directing the employee's work, if you're telling them when and what they're supposed to do, if you're directing how they do it, chances are that they are an employee, right? So if they smell and look like an employee, chances are they are an employee. So there are some risk in terms of mischaracterizing workers who you say are independent contractors that are not truly independent versus employees. So if someone is working exclusively for your company, right, 9 to 5, you're giving them a fixed amount and you call them an independent contractor, but you're telling them what to do and when to come in and they're working really for you, they could be deemed an employee, or they could be what's called a dependent contractor, which I won't get into, but it's important to make sure you are classifying employees as employees, because if you don't, these employees may still go and file a claim and say, I'm an employee and I'm not an independent contractor, and therefore I'm entitled to some kind of severance pay as a result. In terms of mitigating the layoffs and the salary reduction, again, as I said, there's not much you can do aside from making sure you're transparent with the employees and getting their consent to it, right? If the employees understand that you're trying to take these measures in order to make sure there's a business and a workplace they can go to, chances are there's less of a chance that they're going to raise their hand and say, I've been constructively dismissed, right? So making sure that you explain to the employees why you're taking those measures and the temporary nature of those measures are always very important.
Okay. Another question here from Errol. Any potential legal liabilities possibly due to these new physical distancing guidelines?
In terms of if you're not meeting those physical distancing rules?
That would be my guess.
Yeah, so there are. So I mean, from a workplace perspective, right? If you're not implementing those social distancing rules, and these are your employees, right? Chances are, if they get COVID-19 as a result of being at work, right? There are if you guys are registered with WSIB, this could be a potential WSIB claim as well, right? So there is potential liability if you're not taking the reasonable precaution that you need to as a business, right? So you want to think about making sure that you take those steps, like any other illness in the workplace, that you're taking the measures necessary to minimize the possibility that these employees are going to get sick from being at work. So yes, you want to make sure that you are implementing those rules. And if you are, and show that you've taken those measures, it is going to minimize the risk that there is going to be liability down the road. But if you're not taking those measures and employees are contacting or contracting COVID-19 at work, then that's going to expose you in terms of those risks. It may expose your customers as well. So these are things that you need to think about.
Okay. There was another statement here. Temperature checking is a non-healthcare and interaction with human rights. Explain that. What's your thoughts on that?
So temperature check, there's a lot of debate about, whether temperature checks are actually worth it or not, right? And then there's the debate as to whether, if you find somebody who's tested positive or find something, are there, other issues? You want to be, if you are deciding to go down the route of temperature check-in of your employees, which, unless you really need to, we generally don't recommend. You want to make sure that whoever is doing it is, first of all, trained to do it properly, right? You're only getting the information that's necessary. So you're not getting information, you're not asking the employee about other, what other disability or medical conditions they have. You're only testing to see what the temperature is and whether they are above or below that temperature, and in terms of that. And in terms of what information that you keep, right? You want to make sure that you're doing it in a private setting where it's only on a need-to-know basis. So these are all of the things that you can do to mitigate those risks. There are obviously privacy concerns in, whatever province you're in. So you want to keep that in mind in terms of what information you're collecting and disclosing or having access to. So the bottom line is that if you decide to do it, and I frankly don't think a small business needs to go that far, but if you decide to do it, make sure you're doing it properly. Again, there is some guidance that's available on a number of the websites, the public health website, in terms of temperature screening, but making sure that you're only getting as much information as you need to determine whether the employee should be or should not be at work, and nothing else.
Okay. Now let's roll back into what you were getting into previously in terms of some of the emerging challenges. But before we get into that, as a small business, again, for larger, medium and larger businesses, there's probably a lot more, opportunities or there's probably more infrastructure to manage going forward.
Yeah.
For the smaller companies, say they're interactive for whatever state and they only have a fixed space, is it that they got to do shields to protect from personal space? Like some places don't have a limited amount of space.
Yeah.
What if someone's not comfortable with that, or what if they can't afford that? What do you see happening?
Well, we'll see. And that's why I always say you have to, as a small business, it's important to think outside the box and be creative, right? So you want to make sure saying that you only have a small space is not an excuse to not implement social distancing rules. That's the bottom line, right? You need to do something
Yeah.
to make sure that your employees are safe and to make sure whoever gets into the business, the families of your employees are safe as well. So if you have a small space and you cannot implement social distancing in your office, plexiglass is something, but whether that works or not, right? If you're there for 9 hours, I'm sure you're not going to stay behind your plexiglass, right? So, I think you want to be mindful of that. Is it possible if it's an office space, do the employees have to be at the office on the same day, right? So if you have a space with 4 employees, you have only 2 employees coming on Mondays, you have two coming on Tuesdays, and you alternate, right? So trying to be creative, because at the end of the day, the employees know that you have their health and safety at heart and nothing else. They will work with you to try to make it work, right? So think about, and there's nothing wrong with sitting with your employees. If you have a small business and saying, listen, staff, we're going back to the office on Monday, offices are reopening. Let's think about what we can do to make this work, right? They may have ideas that you may have never thought of, right? So you really do want to spend some time and work those out, but don't say that because it's a small space, it's a small business, I don't have the same responsibilities that other employees would have. The bottom line is that you have a responsibility to make sure that you're providing a place of employment that's, meets the health and safety obligations.
Perfect. Again, everyone, it's Michelle Henry. She's from BLG. She's a partner there specializing in employment law, particularly, and we're talking today from an employer's perspective. So let's go right back to what we were going on before, Michelle. So talk to us a little bit more of some of the emerging challenges you've seen. You said you talked about a screening. You talked about continuing to work from home arrangements. What else have you seen?
So we've talked a little bit about, the dealing with employees who are either unable or unwilling to come to work, right? So as a small business, you may have some part-time staff, right? You may have some part-time staff who you're paying just a little bit above minimum wage, and that's fine. We are finding that, for part-time staff who are sort of low income, it's more attractive to stay on serve as opposed to coming back to work. So if you can get $500 a week for free and to stay at home until October, chances are you may not want to come back to the office, right? Or to the workplace to make just a little bit more or a little bit less than that. So that's a big challenge for small businesses, because you want to make sure that when you have work available, you have your workforce coming in.
Yeah.
So and then on the other hand, so you have these employees who actually don't have a valid reason for being off work, aside from the fact that they want to get paid to do nothing. But you also have these employees who, again, may have kids at home or may have some of the family obligations that are keeping them at home. So it's important to spend the time to figure out, if these employees are asking to stay home and not return to work when the reopening starts, or if your business is already open, spending the time and figuring out, why is this person unable to come back to work? Is it because of a protected leave? So do they fall under the emergency leave requirements because of the kids, of the support they need to provide? Or is it because that they simply uncomfortable coming back to work, right? They may have an existing medical condition that may make them more susceptible to getting COVID. So that may be something in terms of accommodation that you need to think about. Or is it the third category where they just don't want to come back because there's really from a financial perspective, it doesn't make sense. So make sure you're documenting those conversations with the employee. Don't just, say, fine, you quit, I'm not, going to think about you anymore, right? So spending the time and asking the employee, okay, can you send me an email explaining to me why you're unable to come back to work, and then going from there. And if it's a valid leave, right, where they fall under one of the categories that we talked about, or if it's a medical condition where there's a duty to accommodate, you want to make sure that you're trying to think of what measures you're going to take, right? So whether you keep them on layoff indefinitely until they're able to come back to work and accommodate them that way. Or if it's a third category where you sort of say, okay, fine, we're going to deem you to have quit your employment because you don't want to come back to work, or do we just leave you off on leave and don't do anything? So it's important to ask those questions up front, but that's something that I think a lot of small businesses may have to deal with when they have employees with lower wages. The other thing that we are seeing is that, the reality is that for some businesses, it will take some time before business picks up again, right? So you may have 10 employees in your workforce, and you may realize that you only need 7 employees going forward until you figure out what you're going to do. So figuring out who those 3 employees are going to be, who you now have to terminate the employment permanently or lay them off, indefinitely, whatever terminology you use, and making sure that you are doing that from an objective place, right? So if you're looking at it from a business perspective, what are the roles these employees are doing? How do I make a determination as to who goes and who stays, right? So we want to think about human rights issues in that regard. So for instance, if you're a Black business owner and you have 10 Black employees, and the 3 employees that you let go are the 3 white employees, right? Those white employees may say, well, this is a race issue. You're only keeping your brothers and your sisters, and you're firing all the white people, right? So you want to make sure, or the employees who are disabled, you have 10 employees and you have 3 employees who are always on some medical leave because they have some medical issue that's been ongoing. And you say, okay, this is my opportunity to get rid of these employees because they have ongoing disabilities. That can lead you into hot water as well, because if you discriminate against them based on disability, then you don't want to be making those decisions. So spending time in terms of any kind of workforce reduction and thinking about, who do I let go and why am I picking this person to be let go? It has to be an objective reason why you were doing it, and making sure that you can really stand by your decision at the end of the day. If you have to defend it before the Human Rights Tribunal, for instance, can I explain from a legal or from a business perspective why I let this person go as opposed to another person? So keeping all of these in mind and trying to have those discussions or these upfront, as opposed to trying to figure it out after you've let the person go.
Interesting. Okay. So let's talk about that. If in the event you let someone go or a layoff, and your business begins to pick back up, are you required to hire the same employees back?
No, you're not. I mean, as long as it's a business related reasons why you let them go, right? You're not required to hire them. I mean, I assume all of you guys are non-unionized. So in a unionized setting, of course, it's a collective agreement that governs layoff and recalls. But in a non-unionized setting, if you have a business reason for laying an employee off, you don't have to rehire them as a result of that, right?
All right. So essentially, so anyone that was potentially laid off at this juncture under the COVID umbrella, say you were laid off, or you
are we talking about a permanent layoff or a temporary layoff?
Either one, under any umbrella, under this circumstance, as an employer, and say I have an employee that was challenging to begin with, can I hire another one, or will that put me in hot waters?
So not liking an employee or challenging an employee, is not a protected ground. So certainly you can decide to get rid of your bad apples now. The problem is you want to make sure that there is no sort of human rights risk, right? So sometimes your bad apples are the ones who are also calling sick all the time and they have a medical issue. And they may say that it's not because I'm a bad apple or because I'm challenging that I was fired, it's because I was always taking time off to, go to the doctor and all of that. So you want to spend some time thinking about those issues. And, we've had lots of clients who terminated the bad apples over this COVID situation, right? But you want to make sure there's a business reason for doing it as opposed to just, a human rights reason. And that really what gets you in trouble.
Okay. So going forward now, as they move in and getting back into the workplace, how does a company mitigate the challenges such that deal with things such as increased absenteeism, remote training, or people that now work from home, ensuring they are work from home or as effective or productive? How would an employer start to mitigate some of those risks? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so the work from home and the productivity piece is always something that comes up, but it has been coming up the last few weeks in terms of whether the employees are actually working when they say they are. And you can think of what measures you can put in place to do that, right? So some companies have, when you log into your system, IT can tell you exactly when an employee is on your system or not, right? And it's not over monitoring. You can put those in place. So thinking about those, do you have the employees check in when they log in, right? So, those measures, do you have them where it's always visible? So for instance, our system, it always tells you when somebody's on, right? And there's a green light if they're available, there's a red light if they're in a meeting. So, if you can implement those programs, that's always a good thing to do in terms of mitigating those. Um, if you have an employee who has some key metrics and some key deliverables, right, to do, if they are doing their work, there's no reason to think and be skeptical that they're not actually doing the work if they actually performing just as well as they did when they were in the office. So just monitoring those and those performance issues and dealing with them as they come along it's important in terms of mitigating those risks. In terms of what's the other question you had, Anton, or the first part of the question?
How do you manage going forward things as, again, absenteeism, they could be quote unquote there, but they're really not there, or some of those challenges that you foresee.
Yeah, so you want to make sure that if you're doing a permanent work from home arrangement, as a small business, you may not actually put a 5-page work from home agreement into place, right? But you want to put something in place in terms of what the expectations are, right? So the expectation should be, if you're going to be off work and you need a few hours off, you need to tell your manager, the day before, the morning of. So making sure that you have key expectations lined up for the employee. If you need a day off, you need to tell me in advance and make sure you don't get paid for that day, right? So making sure you set those in advance so the employees understand that they cannot just, piss off for 5 hours and then don't do anything, that they need to make sure they're letting the managers know, even though they're working remotely. So setting those even though it's in an email or it's a 1-page policy, and saying these are the things that we expect from you while you work from home will certainly help to mitigate a lot of those risks.
Okay. And also going forward, at what stage at this point does all business need to get some legal counsel in regards to going forward, ensuring that they're from whether it's PPE is done and distributed, or new policies or management? Is it necessary for small businesses now to be exploring those options?
I think it's important to do it. I think it's important to sit down, understand what the nature of your business, what the risks are for your employees, and thinking about what do I need to implement in order to do that, right? If you have a retail, for instance, right, it may be important to have everybody wear face masks, right? Whereas if you have an office space where people can sit apart and they're not, in each other's faces and there's no chance of them crossing each other, you may not need, a face mask. So spending some time and thinking about the nature of your business and thinking about what kinds of PPEs should I be implementing, or should I be asking the employees to purchase? And that's the other thing, who pays for the PPEs? Do I provide it for the employees, or do the employees come with it, right? So these are some of the costs that will go into it going forward for sure.
Perfect. Now, where would someone go to find out more resources on some of this information? Where to go? What tools to use? What resources?
Yeah, so I will say that some of the public health sites are very good in terms of workplaces, and the Ministry of Labor has a few as well. WSIB has a bunch as well. So certainly, if you just Google COVID and employer obligations, a lot of stuff will likely come up in terms of the resources that are available on those issues. And just generally, I mean, I think a lot of if you go on a lot of the big law firm website, I know BLG, for instance, has a lot of legal alerts that we put out over the last few couple of months, and these are all public, right? So if you just Google wage subsidy, for instance, I'm pretty sure you'll get at least a few firms that have things up. And I'm sure I see Donna Walwin on. I'm sure her firm has a number of resources that are available as well. So these are things that, I think there's a lot of information available online that you can access. And I do invite people to spend some time and do that before they reopen or have people come into work.
Okay. And when they're coming to work, you mentioned it earlier on, who is responsible for the protective materials? For example, the masks, and then who is responsible?
Well, if you can afford to pay for it for the employees, I would encourage you to do that, right? If you're requiring the employees to come in with face masks, then it doesn't cost you that much, right? Especially if they're customer facing, right? If you have them dealing with customers and ultimately that you could be responsible, or you can get your WSIB premiums go up, have you because somebody gets infected at work, then it doesn't cost you that much to take those measures. So think about what can I implement, what's the cost of it, and is it how much is it going to mitigate? Because you don't want an employee coming into work saying, I didn't get my PPE on time, I didn't get my face mask, I ordered it on Amazon and didn't get it on time or something like that. You want to make sure that to the extent that you're requiring it of the employees, that you can have it available as much as possible for the employees.
All right. Well, I just have a question here. It came from Desmond. Can an employer call you and lay you off on a day you requested off and blame it on the pandemic?
Can an employer call you on the day? So that's an employee question, not an employer question, right? Desmond. I'm going to call you out on that, Desmond. So, sometimes you have employees who had already planned vacation time or planned some kind of leave, and all of a sudden now the employer is saying, I'm closing down anyway, right? In those cases, what I've told clients is, if an employee had already requested a paid day off, right, then allow them to take it. But, sometimes it's difficult because when you lay an employee off as a result, on an effective day, you have to issue a record of employment for that employee, right? So if an employee says, listen, I have planned to take a day off 2 weeks from now, right? You're not going to have them laid off for 2 weeks, have them come back for 1 day, and then lay them off again, right? Because it means you have to issue an hourly both times at the employee, and that would certainly impact the ability to collect EI or CERB. So I think you want to, if an employee, had made a request for a day off with pay and the employer says, sorry, you're going to be laid off, then have a conversation with the employee and say, okay, can you at least, move my layoff date by 1 day or a week, whatever time I've requested off. So the first week will be deemed vacation time, and then the rest of that will be, layoff. So again, try to be creative, but certainly an employer has a right to do that and say, listen, I'm laying everybody off effective today, and I can't make any exception because I have to issue an hourly for that day.
Okay. So as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you'd want to say to employers going out of this, or at least how to respond? Is there one thing that's encompassing?
So I am, as much as I'm a bad employment, management side lawyer, I'm always a believer that, you get the employees that you deserve, right? And if you treat your employees properly, chances are they will ensure that you're successful, right? So in all of this, I think the clients who've done really well are the clients who've been very transparent with their employees in terms of what measures they are taking, why they're taking those measures, what they anticipate going forward, and keeping those lines of communication open. So not just lay off the employee and say, I will call you when I call you, but keeping them up to date, saying, give me your email address where I can reach you, and keeping, whether it's a weekly update or, every 2 weeks, updating the employees in terms of what your situation is, what you anticipate, and keeping those lines open. And the more you do that, the better it'll be when the employees are prepared to come back to work or able to come back to work. They will be ready to work, and they will understand that, listen, you did everything in your power to make sure that they actually had an income to come back to. So again, transparency, and getting buy-in from the employees, I would say, are the key for small businesses.
Okay. Michelle Henry, I thank you so much. It's been you actually give a wealth of information. I appreciate your insight and your feedback as it relates to helping employers as they navigate the COVID crisis. With that, I thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Ross.
We can't hear you, Ross. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Let's try that again. Thank you, Anton, for hosting. Michelle, thank you so much for being our guest today. I think the whole employment law is very, very important for us as a community, and I think you start with the end in mind. So you start where you want to be in the future as a small business, and if you start putting the pieces in place for making sure that all your legal issues and employment issues are taken care of from the start. It will bode well for you in the future. So thank you so much, Michelle, for contributing today to our community. I just want to make one announcement. So starting in June, this is our last session for May. Starting in June, we will be moving our sessions to every Wednesday. So we'll have once a week, every Wednesday. So, you know, like they say, tell a friend to tell a friend. Let's invite folks to these sessions, because I think they're important to us as a community. So our first session on June the 3rd will be our good friend here, Anton, will be wearing a different hat, and he'll be talking to us about overcoming sales and prospecting and closing business post-COVID. And I think this is important because like we kind of had a little bit of a hiatus through COVID. Things moving towards the new normal, and you know, as people with businesses, whether you be a lawyer, small business owner, an entrepreneur, you know, whatever business you're in, you've got to sell, right? And I think this topic is timely. So again, thank you everybody for joining. We look forward to seeing all of you, plus your friends, on June the 3rd. Thanks a lot, and thanks again, Michelle.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
You too.
Stay safe, everyone.